What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Best Bets for UFC 323, Merab Dvalishvili versus Petr Yan 2, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog in the week, and some parlays that I like. Hope y'all are doing well. Let's dive into the most confident picks for this card, where we got Alexandre Pantoja, Merab Dvalishvili, and Mansour Abdul Malik. Starting off with Alexandre Pantoja, I just think Alexandre Pantoja's relentless pressure, his elite chain wrestling, and his suffocating submission threats are going to wear down Joshua Van. I expect him to break Van's rhythm, drag him into the mat, and then find a submission and finish him. Joshua Van, he's one of the most exciting rising stars in the sport right now. The aura, the pressure, the highlight reel striking. And that short notice win over Brennan Royval, that was huge for him. He's a legit contender. But the problem is, he's not just fighting anyone. He's fighting Alexandre Pantoja. Pantoja's style is just pure chaos and savagery. He doesn't give respect. He walks you down and drags you to hell. And he forces you to fight his fight. He's on an 8-fight win streak right now. Has cleaned out the division. And his grappling is levels above almost anyone's. His striking isn't pretty, but it's wildly effective. A constant blitzes, nonstop pressure, brutal chain wrestling on top of that. And never lets opponents breathe. And once he gets you thinking about the striking, you're suddenly defending takedowns after takedowns after takedowns. Van can have his moments on the feet for sure, with his counters, with his pressure. But to win this fight, he'd have to defend elite takedowns for 25 minutes straight against a guy who won't stop shooting on him, and has never been finished. Alexandre Pantoja has never been finished. And that's a nightmare assignment. Once Pantoja gets him grounded, the submission threat is immediate and it's overwhelming. Even Pantoja himself has openly said that if he could bet, he'd bet on himself by submission. And his track record backs that confidence up. He's doing what he says he's doing. He just can't fade someone like Pantoja in this spot, right? Moving on to our next most confident pick, Merab Dvalishvili. I'm going to say that Merab uses his relentless pressure, his endless wrestling pressure, and mental dominance to win here. He already has a win over Petr Yan. I expect him to drown Yan again and grind out another dominant win. Petr Yan, yeah, he was saying he was injured in the first fight and couldn't throw his right hand. But we have heard similar excuses from other fighters that Merab has dominated, including Umar. At some point, it stops being bad luck with his contenders and it starts being Merab's pressure is just breaking people down. His will, his pace, his gas tank, they're unmatched. Yan is an elite boxer with strong pressure, strong durability, and a high fight IQ when it comes to striking. He's riding a 3-fight win streak and looks sharp. But none of those opponents fight anything like Merab. Merab is the cardio machine, with endless chain wrestling. He's relentlessly moving forward. And even improved striking, as we saw against Corey Sandhagen. Yan, he may defend takedowns early, but that constant defense will drain him. The more he worries about the wrestling, the more openings Merab is going to have on the feet. And we saw Merab already shoot 50 plus times. He attempted 50 plus takedowns in the first fight, and that same suffocating style will be there again. Obviously, the clinch pressure, the knees to the legs, the foot stomps, the short punches, the brief separation only to get hit with the right hand, then right back to pressure. It's mentally exhausting. Merab already has the win over him as well. The mental edge, the stylistic advantage. Nothing about this matchup favors Yan more than the first time they fought, right? So you got to be with Merab in this spot. Moving on to our last most confident pick, Mansour Abdul Malik. I expect him to be faster, stronger, more dangerous everywhere. This feels like a dominant finish waiting to happen, and I'm fully bought into the Mansour Abdul Malik hype. I think this dude is the real deal. His last fight with Cody Brundage, sure, it was overturned to a draw because of the head clash, but Mansour was clearly on his way to winning that fight. Every Brundage fight seems to be cursed with some weird moments, but make no mistake, Mansour was in control of that fight. Before that, he was finishing everyone. This guy's a straight up monster. He's got explosive power, serious knockout ability, and a strong wrestling base on top of that. Plus vicious ground and pound, and he's dangerous everywhere everywhere the fight goes, right? And against Tricoli, this should be a straightforward night for Mansour. Tricoli is 0-2 in the UFC. He got TKO'd by Shar Bullet, which is understandable, but then getting submitted by Treson Gore, it's a major red flag. Even in his wins, there's nothing dominant or impressive about his performances, and he's shown a tendency to get finished when things go bad in his fights. Mansour, he's clearly the superior fighter everywhere. the fight goes. He's the better striker, the stronger wrestler, and the more dangerous finisher. Chikoli's striking defense, it's shaky, and that's a huge problem against someone as fast and explosive as Mansour, right? Chikoli's only real hope here would be catching a surprise submission in a scramble, but that's a massive long shot. Mansour is too sharp, too powerful, and too controlled for any of that home run chances to happen, right? For Chikoli. So pick is obviously the minus 1,000 favorite in Mansour Abdulmalik. Moving on to our lock of the week, Jalen Turner. Jalen Turner is going to be younger, longer, and far more dangerous at this stage in his career. I expect him to hurt Barboza from range and push hard for a finish, and I'm honestly happy to see Jalen Turner back, stepping away from the sport. It looks like he's refocused and he found his hunger again, and the UFC gave him a very winnable comeback matchup, for his comeback fight. Even though Turner, he's lost 4 out of his last 5 fights, two of those losses were close split decisions to decent fighters like Gamrot and Dan Hooker, and he nearly stopped Moicano before making a careless mistake. Those losses aren't bad at all. Now he's facing a 39-year-old Edson Barboza who's clearly past his prime, and Barboza's still a dangerous a fighter when it comes to like his leg kicks mostly. He's not as explosive nowadays. He's no longer the terrifying striker he once was. His recent performances, they haven't stood out. Even fighters like Jakar Close were able to pressure him into bad spots and land clean shots. But Barboza, clearly he's not the same fighter he used to be. He's okay, he still knows the basics. But Turner, he's going to have a huge size and reach advantage in this matchup, along with real power and sneaky submission skills. If the fight hits the ground, he's a pure finisher. 100% finish rate, never won a decision, and that aggressive mindset is dangerous against an aging veteran. With his length, Turner, he can snipe from the outside, punish Barboza in exchanges, and push for the finish once he hurts Barboza. Even if Barboza has early success with leg kicks, that alone, it won't be enough. Turner, he's longer, younger, fresher, and the more dangerous fighter at this stage. The storm he brings should be too much for Barboza to survive in this matchup. And like I said, lost 4 out of his last 5 fights for Turner, but 2 of those were split decision losses. The next loss was Moicano, where he easily could have finished, and then his last loss was Ignacio Bahamondes, who's an absolute killer. Now facing an aging Edson Barboza, this should be an easy win for Turner. I expect him to find a finish here. And the odds have changed from minus 210 to minus 260. Now moving up to minus 270 almost. Yeah, money's coming on him. I see why. Moving on to our underdog of the week, Bruno Ferreira. Bruno Ferreira looks like the more dangerous fighter in this matchup. He brings real knockout power on the feet, constant forward pressure, and he has legit submission skills on the ground. And he's riding a solid 2-fight win streak, finishing Jackson McVeigh really quickly and submitting Armin Petrosian before that. On top of that, he even owns a knockout win over Gregory Rodriguez, which is really impressive. Even though Ferreira, he's undersized for middleweight, he's shown he can be He can be a fighter who closes distance nicely. He can force grappling and hurt his bigger opponents. Marvin Vettori, on the other hand, he's known for his volume, his pressure, his durability. Not damage though. He doesn't have a single knockout win in the UFC. And while his chin, it's legendary, right? He's got the legendary Vettori chin. Being known as the guy who absorbs a ton of punishment, eventually it's going to catch up to you. He's hittable. He relies heavily on walking guys down with his volume and doesn't carry the kind of offense that scares elite finishers like Bruno Ferreira. Bruno Ferreira should find success both striking and grappling. His early pressure and power, they could seriously damage Vettori in the first round. And even if Marvin survives, Ferreira's shots will likely be the more impactful moments of the whole fight, and Marvin's best chance is probably to clinch and grind to neutralize Bruno's power. But even then, Bruno should still be landing the better shots in those exchanges. So the pick has to be Bruno Ferreira. I think he's going to be more dangerous everywhere. I think he's going to land the heavier damage, especially early on in the fight, and he's either going to find a finish or wins the fight on decisive moments with his damaging shots and pressure, right? So underdog of the week, Bruno Ferreira. Moving on to the parlay section. Minus 200, Jalen Turner and Mansoor Abdul Malik for the safety lock. Look, the odds obviously are not the best, minus 200, but this is a really tough card to predict. And in my opinion, this is as safe as you can get. You know, I'm trying to keep the parlay streak alive. Last 4 weeks, they have been hitting like crazy. So I'm playing it safe in a card that's hard to predict. And if you want safe, I think this is for sure hitting, you know. Jalen Turner and Mansoor Abdul Malik. Turner, you know, he has the huge age, size, and power advantage over an aging Edson Barboza. Barboza's game is now mostly too predictable using his leg kicks, and it's just the basic stuff. You know, with Turner, he has the reach, he's got the power, and he has finishing instincts to punish Barboza in this matchup. You know, Barboza, he also struggles really badly once pressured into the clinch, and when he gets overwhelmed, he kind of just starts to fade. And Jalen Turner is going to put that pressure on, you know. Pairing him up with Mansoor Abdul Malik, I think that's a free win in Mansoor Abdul Malik. Simply, he's on another level, you know, athletically and explosively compared to Tricoli. Tricoli's striking defense is really poor, and he's been finished in both of his UFC losses, you know. And Mansoor, he's just too dangerous everywhere, on the feet and on the mat. This parlay, it works because both guys, they have clear finishing upside and are finishing opponents. They can finish their opponents who have big defensive gaps, right? So that's a safety lock. Moving on to the ultimate lock, Jalen Turner pairing him up with the champion Merab. You know, again, Turner, he has the length, the power, the submission threats against a declining veteran in Barboza. And then you're pairing him up with Merab. I think Merab is the safest type of champion to bet on. Insane cardio, relentless pressure, and chain wrestling that just never stops. You know, Yan, he can box beautifully, but Merab's pace, he's going to break. He breaks these strikers over time, you know, just like the first fight, you know, just like any striker you put in front of him. Merab's stylistic way of fighting, it's made to break these types of strikers, you know. So it works out because, you know, Turner, he's gonna bring the damage, and Merab's gonna bring the control. Two completely different but equally reliable win conditions for the ultimate lock. Minus 150. I think that one hits as well. Moving on to the Afforadble Juice section, plus 100 at even odds for Pantoja and Peyton Talbot. Pantoja, he's simply the most dangerous flyweight grappler ever, right? You know, his pressure, his chain wrestling, his submissions, they're a nightmare for a young striker like Joshua Van. Even if Van has his moments, Pantoja's scrambling submission threats, they are inevitable, right? That's just his game, and I think it's going to work in this matchup versus Joshua Van. You know, Talbot, pairing him up with Talbot. Talbot's explosive, you know, aggressive, and always hunting for the finish against someone like Cejudo, who's aging, shorter, and slowing down. Talbot's pace and power are serious problems. You know, this is the first time as well where Cejudo fights anyone that's 5'10". This is his tallest opponent yet, and Talbot is seriously dangerous for that to be your first opponent in being being the tallest opponent you've ever faced, right? So this parlay, Afforadble Juice, it's even money, plus 100. Both guys have dominant finishing abilities in their matchups. You know, they're not decision-dependent outcomes, but even then, they can still win a decision, right? Moving on to the four most confident picks, Merab, Jalen, Pantoja, Mansoor. You got Merab with his suffocating pace and cardio. Jalen, his size and knockout submission upside. Pantoja, elite submission chains. And Mansoor, he's just got raw power and athletic. It's an athletic mismatch, right? This parlay, it works because every fighter has their strengths here, you know, with wrestling, power, submissions, and pressure. You know, these confident picks lowers the chance of one bad stylistic matchup ruining the whole thing. I think all of them should come through, you know. Moving on to the fun duo, Chris Duncan and Tatsuro Taira. Duncan's going to be aggressive. He's going to be physical, and he has the right kind of grit that does well in scrappy fights, you know. And I do think he's live to find the finish here. Pairing him up with Taira, who's a future star, you know, elite grappling, composure that's way beyond his age, and constant submission threats. For a two-legger that's giving out plus 170, I do think it comes through, you know. So moving on to the Underdog City Sprinkle, Muhammadjan Naimov and Bruno Ferreira at plus 500. Naimov, he always brings the chaos. You know, he has power as well. And he just has that relentless pressure style. So pairing him up with Bruno Ferreira, who is one of the most dangerous finishers in middleweight, with huge power, slick submissions, and he just has no fear against a hittable, pressuring guy like Vettori. That power is live to rock Vettori at all times, you know. So it's the perfect sprinkle material. Both guys are live for some serious violent finishes, right? And you only need one big moment from each guy to sway the fight in their favor. So I do think Underdog City, obviously, worth the sprinkle. So that does conclude this card's best bets for this week. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys found this helpful. Take care of yourselves, man. Good luck to you. I'm out. Peace.